The email arrived at 7:43 on a Thursday morning. The subject line said, "Employment Status Update." I had been with the company for 21 years. I had started when I was 32, when the company had 40 employees and operated out of 2 floors of a building that smelled permanently of printer ink and someone's microwaved fish. I had watched it grow to 400 people across 3 offices. I had been part of that growth in ways that I will describe precisely, because precision matters when someone tries to rewrite the story of what you contributed. I was not notified by phone. I was not asked to come in. I was not given a meeting with HR or a conversation with my manager of 12 years. I was sent an email. At 7:43 in the morning. On my 53rd birthday. I want to tell you what happened after that. Because what happened after that took 14 months and it was, in the end, exactly what it needed to be. Chapter 1, The Beginning. I joined Meridian Solutions in the spring as their head of client strategy. Meridian at that time was a mid-sized consulting firm with good clients, reasonable processes, and a leadership team that had good instincts but was slightly chaotic in the way that growing companies often are, moving fast, making decisions without full information, occasionally brilliant and occasionally catastrophically wrong. I had come from a larger firm where I had spent 8 years and learned a great deal but had reached a ceiling that felt structural rather than circumstantial. I was not going to advance further there. Not because I was not capable but because the path forward required a particular kind of political navigation that I was not willing to perform. So I left. And I joined Meridian. And for the first 8 years it was one of the best decisions I had ever made. I built the client strategy practice essentially from scratch. I want to be specific about what that means because it matters to what comes later. When I arrived, client strategy was a loosely defined function that sat between sales and delivery and was not particularly well respected by either. Clients were acquired, handed to delivery teams, and managed through a combination of relationship maintenance and reactive problem solving. I changed that. Over 8 years I developed a methodology, a formal, documented, trainable approach to client engagement that moved the function from reactive to proactive, and that became, over time, the reason our retention rate was the highest in the industry for our category. I trained 37 people in that methodology over the years I was at Meridian. I documented every element of it in a system I created called the Client Architecture Framework. The Client Architecture Framework became what Meridian sold. Not explicitly. They did not put my name on it. But the pitch deck that the sales team used, the training materials that onboarded new consultants, the performance metrics used to evaluate client health, all of it was built on what I had built. I knew this. I had built it. I was not resentful of it. What I had not understood, until the email at 7:43 on my birthday, was how completely the company had decided that my ongoing presence was no longer necessary to their use of what I had created. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. The email was brief. I have read it many times since. I practically have it memorized. It said that due to a strategic restructuring of the client strategy function, my role was being eliminated effective immediately. It thanked me for my contributions. It said that a member of HR would be in touch regarding offboarding procedures and that my access to company systems would be disabled at close of business. It was signed by the Chief Operating Officer, a man named Philip Garrett who had joined the company 14 months earlier. Who had spent those 14 months, I now understood, systematically restructuring every function he considered legacy. I had not liked Philip Garrett from the first month. I want to be honest about that because I think it is relevant and because I am not going to pretend I had no warning signs. He had a particular way of asking questions that was not actually curiosity but inventory. He wanted to know how things worked so he could assess whether they needed to continue to work the same way under his vision of the company. I had answered his questions thoroughly. Because I believed in transparency and because I had nothing to hide about what I had built. In retrospect, I had answered his questions too thoroughly. I had explained the client architecture framework in detail in 2 separate meetings with Philip and his newly hired team. I had walked them through the methodology, the training protocols, the client health metrics. I had, without understanding it at the time, handed him everything he needed to run the practice without me. And then he had waited until he was confident it would work without me. And then he had sent the email. The offboarding call with HR happened 2 days later. It lasted 11 minutes. I was informed of my severance, a sum that was technically within the legal requirements but that bore no relationship to 21 years of contribution, and asked to return my company laptop and badge by end of week. I asked about the non-disclosure agreement they wanted me to sign. The HR representative said it was standard. I said I would have my lawyer review it. There was a pause. She said, "Of course." I said, "I'll be in touch." I hung up. And I sat at my desk, my home desk. I had been working remotely for 2 years by this point, and I looked at the email and the severance offer and the NDA and I made a decision. I was not going to sign anything until I understood exactly what I was being asked not to say. Chapter 3, The Decision. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Sandra Okafor and she had been recommended to me by a former colleague who had gone through something similar 3 years earlier and had described Sandra as someone who combined exceptional legal knowledge with what she called a complete absence of sentimentality about corporations. Sandra Okafor read the NDA, the severance offer, and my employment contract. She called me the next morning. She said, "The NDA is aggressive. They're asking you to sign away your right to discuss your methodology, your training materials, and what they're calling proprietary processes." I said, "What I'm hearing is that they want me to agree that what I built belongs to them." She said, "That's essentially correct." I said, "I want to understand exactly what I own and what they own." She said, "That's exactly the right question. Let's start there." What followed was 3 weeks of document review. I had been, throughout my career, meticulous about keeping records. Not with any particular strategy in mind, it was simply how I worked. I documented decisions. I kept copies of key communications. I had drafts of the client architecture framework going back to its earliest iterations, with dates and revision histories. Sandra reviewed all of it. And then she called me again. She said, "I need to ask you something important. When you were developing the framework, did you ever use company resources exclusively, or were there periods when you were working on it on personal time with personal equipment?" I thought about it carefully. I said, "The earliest versions were developed on my personal laptop at home before I had finalized the structure enough to present it internally. I have the original files. The metadata will show when they were created and on what device." Sandra was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's significant." I said, "How significant?" She said, "Potentially very." Over the following weeks I began to understand something I had not fully understood before. I had not simply been an employee who had done good work. I had created something with identifiable intellectual structure that existed before it was formally adopted by the company, that had been developed using personal resources during personal time, and that the company was now attempting to claim exclusive ownership of as a condition of my severance. Sandra filed an initial letter of dispute with their legal team. Their lawyers responded within a week. The response was confident and dismissive. It was the response of a legal team that expected the other side to eventually accept the terms because the other side was an individual and they were a corporation, and that is usually how these things go. They had not yet reviewed my documentation. Chapter 4, The Evidence. I want to tell you about something I found while I was going through my records. It was in an email thread from 8 years earlier, a thread between me and my manager at the time, a woman named Rachel who had since left the company and who had been, during our years working together, one of the most straightforwardly decent people I had encountered in a professional setting. The thread was about the early version of the client architecture framework. Specifically, it was about whether to formally present it to the leadership team. And in that thread I had written something that I had not remembered writing. I had written, "I want to be clear that this methodology was developed independently and I am choosing to implement it here because I believe it will benefit our clients. I'm happy to have it become part of how we operate, but I want the record to reflect its origins." Rachel had responded, noted and agreed. "I'll make sure this is on record." She had made sure it was on record. The email was in my archive, timestamped, with her response attached. Sandra received it from me at 9 in the morning. She called me at 11. She said, "This changes things considerably." She said, "I'd like to contact your former manager." Rachel was, when Sandra reached her, immediately and enthusiastically cooperative. She remembered the conversation. She had kept her own records. She had, in fact, been appalled by what had happened to me. She had heard through mutual contacts, and had been waiting, she said, for someone to ask her to help. There is a particular satisfaction in discovering that the person you trusted 8 years ago was exactly as trustworthy as you believed. The case built slowly over the following months. Sandra was methodical. She did not move faster than the evidence supported. She documented everything, the timeline of the framework's development, the evidence of its origin outside the company, the email thread, Rachel's testimony, the metadata from my personal files. Meanwhile, I had started doing something else. I had started working. Not for a new employer. For myself. I registered a consultancy. I reached out, carefully and within the bounds of what Sandra had advised, to former clients I had relationships with, relationships that were mine, built over years, not the company's. 3 of them agreed to work with me within the first month. By month 4 I had 6 clients. By month 8 the revenue was approaching what my salary had been. I want to be careful not to make this sound easy because it was not easy. There were weeks that were frightening. There was a month where I questioned everything. There was a night, about 5 months in, when I sat in my kitchen at midnight and thought seriously about whether I should have just signed the NDA and taken the money and moved on. I did not sign the NDA. I did not take the money. I stayed at my kitchen table until 3 in the morning and I thought about what I had built and what it had cost me and what it was worth. And I decided it was worth continuing. Chapter 5, The Justice. The legal resolution came in 2 parts. The first part was the intellectual property dispute. After 9 months of proceedings, their lawyers made an offer. Not a concession, they would never have called it a concession. An offer of settlement that included a formal licensing agreement under which the company would pay me a continuing fee for the ongoing use of the client architecture framework, acknowledgement of my authorship in their internal documentation, and a revision of the NDA to remove the provisions Sandra had identified as overreaching. Plus a significantly revised severance figure. I reviewed it with Sandra for 2 days. Then I signed it. Not because I had gotten everything I wanted. Because I had gotten what I needed, and because the alternative was years more of proceedings that would cost me time and energy that I would rather spend on my consultancy. The second part was less formal but, in some ways, more satisfying. 6 months after the settlement, Meridian lost 3 of their largest clients. I know this because 2 of those clients called me. They had not left because of anything I had done. They had left because the client strategy practice, without the methodology that had driven their retention, had begun to show the cracks that happen when a system is operated by people who understand its mechanics but not its principles. 2 of those clients became my clients. I want to be clear, I did not pursue them. I did not approach them. I answered my phone when they called and I explained what I was able to offer and they made their own decisions. Philip Garrett left the company 14 months after I did. I heard this from someone inside and did not reach out for confirmation because confirming it was not something I needed. What I needed I had already gotten. A consultancy that is, as I sit here telling you this story, busier than I can comfortably manage and that I am in the process of hiring for. A morning routine that does not include checking an email from someone who has decided my contributions are no longer required. And a very clear understanding of something I want to share with you. What you build is yours. Not legally, the law is complicated and Sandra Okafor can explain the nuances better than I can. But in the sense that matters. The expertise you develop, the methodologies you create, the way you understand a problem and approach its solution, those things live in you. They cannot be taken by an email at 7:43 in the morning. They went with me when I left. They are the reason I am sitting here telling you this story from a position of stability rather than one of defeat. When everything was taken, what remained was what had always been mine. I hope that is useful to someone listening today. I think it might be. Thank you for being here. New story every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. I will see you in the next one. I want to tell you one more thing about Philip Garrett. Not out of bitterness. I have moved past bitterness, mostly, in the way that you move past things that are no longer useful to carry. But because I think it illustrates something important about how these situations actually work. Philip Garrett came to Meridian with a vision. The vision was real, I do not doubt that. He genuinely believed that the company needed restructuring and that his way of doing it was correct. What he did not understand was that the things he was restructuring were not interchangeable parts. They were systems built by specific people over specific years through specific failures and recoveries and refinements. You can learn the methodology. You cannot learn the judgment that built it. He learned the methodology. And the methodology, without the judgment behind it, produced results for a while. Reasonable results. Results that looked like the original from a distance. But a copy of a thing is not the thing. And eventually the clients could feel the difference. I do not say this with satisfaction. I say it because I think it is true and because I think it matters to anyone who is in the middle of watching something they built be taken and repurposed by someone who believes that possession is the same as understanding. It is not the same. The 21 years I spent at Meridian gave me something that no email could take away and no NDA could contain. They gave me the judgment. And the judgment is what the consultancy runs on. And the consultancy is doing very well. That is the full story. Or at least, it is the part of the story I am ready to tell. The rest of it is still being written, in the way that all the best stories are, not in the past but in the present, not in what was taken but in what was built from what remained. Thank you for listening to all of it. I want to tell you about the morning I got the email. Not the reading of it, I have told you that. The hour after. I sat at my desk for a while after I read it. Just sat. Not crying, not making calls, not doing anything. Just sitting with the information. And then I did something that I have thought about many times since. I opened my work calendar and looked at what was on it for that day. 2 client calls. A team stand-up. A working session with one of my junior colleagues on a proposal we had been building together. All of it, as of 7:43 that morning, no longer mine to attend. I looked at the team stand-up in particular. Every Thursday morning at 9. I had run it for 8 years. I had started it, designed the format, trained the people who ran it after I had handed off the facilitation. It was, in its small way, one of the things I was most quietly proud of, a meeting that actually worked, that people attended willingly, that produced something useful in 45 minutes and ended on time. They would run it without me that morning. And they would run it the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that, and the format I had built would keep working because I had built it well. I found, sitting with that thought, that it did not diminish me. It confirmed something. What I had built was real enough to outlast my presence. That is not a small thing. I have thought about it since as the difference between the work and the job. The job is what you are paid to do in a specific place for a specific organization. The work is what you know how to do, what you have learned, what you have refined, what lives in you. The email at 7:43 took my job. It could not touch the work. And the work was what the consultancy was built from. I want to say something about the morning of my birthday specifically. Because I think it was not an accident that the email came that day. I cannot prove it. I have no evidence. Philip Garrett may have simply sent it on a Thursday without checking or caring what Thursday it was. But I have been in organizations long enough to know that people who are good at certain kinds of cruelty are often good at the timing of it. The message of a termination email on your birthday is not subtle. It says, your value to this organization is less than the date on a calendar. I received that message. And then I put it down. Because I had work to do. The consultancy is called what it is called because I wanted a name that said something true. I called it After 21. Not as a reference to the years at Meridian specifically, I did not want to define the new thing by the thing I had left. But as a reference to what comes after a long chapter ends. After 21 years of building something for someone else, what do you build for yourself? That is the question that consultancy answers every day. The answer is, something better. Not better in every way. There are things about working inside a large organization that I genuinely miss, the colleagues, the resources, the sense of institutional weight behind what you do. But better in the ways that matter. What I build now has my name on it. Every methodology, every process, every client relationship. Mine. Not transferred to someone else's pitch deck while I am sent an email on my birthday. Mine. That is the thing I want to leave you with. If you are someone who has spent years building something inside an organization that has taken it and left you aside, I want you to hear this clearly. They can take the chair and the access card and the email address. They cannot take what you know. And what you know, when you are ready to use it for yourself, is worth considerably more than what they paid you for it. I know this now with certainty. I knew it, actually, on the morning of the email, not consciously, but in the part of me that sat at that desk and looked at the calendar and felt, underneath the shock and the anger, something that it took me a few weeks to identify. Relief. The long chapter had ended. The next one was starting. And it turned out, the better one. Thank you for listening. New story every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. I will see you in the next one.